I'm Rob Tracinski. This is Symposium, where we talk about the ideas at the basis of a free society. My guest today is Chelsea Follett, who is managing editor of humanprogress.org, which you may very well have heard mentioned at Symposium before, and also the author of a recent book, Centers of Progress. Thanks for coming on to talk to me.
Thank you so much for having me on. I'm glad that we finally get together and do this.
Yeah, terrific. Well, like I said, I've been following your work at Human Progress, including the series that led to this, that was gathered together into this book for some time. So first I want to talk a little bit, before we get to the book, I want to talk about humanprogress.org, because it's one of my favorite sites. It's something I think is a real vital resource, because basically exists to chart and explain the very fact of human progress. So let's talk a little bit about what humanprogress.org is and what it does.
Absolutely. So humanprogress.org is Cato's International Development Data Bank website, where we track every non-controversial measure of progress and well-being that you can imagine. Everything from literacy rates rising, falling rates of poverty and malnutrition, growing access to political liberty, gender equality, all sorts of different aspects of progress. And some people don't like the word progress. They associate it with progressivism, the political movement. There are some politicized definitions of progress, but we really take the most non-controversial definition possible. Anything that anyone across the political spectrum would agree makes life better, from living longer, healthier lives, being better educated, having more prosperity. These are the kinds of things that we track. And tracking all of these different indicators of well-being, we have nearly 1,000 on the website that we get from reliable third-party sources like the World Bank and the UN. We see overwhelmingly that the trend lines over the long term are positive. Obviously, there are disruptions. During the pandemic recently, we saw many of these different trend lines dip, but that has since reversed. So I spent a lot of time thinking about where all of this progress comes from. While we at the Cato Institute believe that it is policies and institutions of freedom and openness that ultimately help to bring about this progress, on the website, we just let the data speak for itself. But we also do publish different writings that try to contextualize this progress and explain it. And in thinking about all of this progress and where it comes from, eventually that led to the idea for this book, Centers of Progress, 40 Cities That Changed the World, that looks very literally and geographically at where so many of the innovations that make the modern world first arrived.
Right. So you talked about how some people react to progress because it's associated with progresses, and that bugs me, because you're letting one particular faction define this basic concept of life. It's like one of my long pet peeves, especially that I explore through Symposium, is the way that liberal got used to mean one particular view of what kind of welfare state we should have, as opposed to meaning, a pro-freedom agenda. So it's the way in which these things get, these terminology is distorted. But I want to talk a little bit about, well, just before we get into the cities and to the 40 cities that you talk about, I want to talk a little bit about how you really do have to sort of like drive into people this idea of progress. So the Washington Post had a piece recently where they did a survey about asking people, when was the best year for such and such? And it wasn't progress in general. It was all sorts of different fields: economics, sports, music. And of course, what they found is that they didn't get a consistent result. The one consistent result they got was what age you were, at the point when you thought everything was the best. And they found consistently that people thought things, basically the world was the best when I was a kid, when I, was shielded from all the bad things that are happening. I wasn't responsible for anything. My parents were in charge of everything. My parents were protecting me. That's when you thought things were best. Or, music was best when you were 17 and everything goes downhill from there. And what struck me, though, is the one other consistent finding they got was when they asked people, when is the worst time? They all responded with one thing, which is now. And so I'm sure you found you have to sort of like keep beating back against this sort of psychological tendency towards doomerism and towards thinking everything's declined.
Absolutely. There are many different facets of human psychology that incline us toward Pessimism. As you said, one of them is that we tend to associate the age of our own youth with, the best age in history. Obviously, that is not necessarily the case. It wouldn't make sense. When you look at the grand sweep of history, it is astonishing just how much living standards have improved. The world of our ancestors would be unimaginable to the modern mind. It would be, I think, traumatic to actually time travel back to the past and to witness firsthand just how horrific life was in that, in the pre-industrial age especially, but throughout the entirety of the past. The current project I'm working on, which you can find on humanprogress.org, named The Grim Old Days, looks at firsthand contemporary accounts of life, everyday life for ordinary people, not soldiers. We all know they had it they had it hard during wars, right? Not slaves. We all know they suffered terribly, and there were many of them, but just ordinary, average people in the past. And their lives were not easy. And because the human brain longs for the negative, I think, more than positive news, I expect that drawing attention to how difficult life was in the past will actually be more appealing to people than trying to focus their attention on moments of innovation and positivity, as this last book, Centers of Progress, 40 Cities That Changed the World, tries to do. But in writing this book, I'm often asked, if you could visit one of the cities in the book, which one would you visit? And my answer to that is that while I appreciate the different innovations that came out of different cities through different times in history, I would not want to travel back to any of them, because living in this moment today, we have access to the great art of Renaissance Florence. We can view that easily online or in museums. We have access to the writings of ancient Greek philosophers without having to witness the sale of slaves in their marketplace in ancient Athens, without having to risk contracting the plague in Renaissance Florence again. You can view their art today. The actual everyday experience of life in the past was horrific, and I do not think any modern person would want to go back in time and experience it. But we can learn from history and the moments of innovation when people, despite the incredible challenges of life in the past, nonetheless made positive change. I think those moments hold lessons for us that we can implement today to continue making innovation in the present.
Yeah. So one of the things, the flip side though, this talking about how terrible the past was, and it was, I mean, in a lot of ways, but also it's true that progress was occurring throughout all of history, that we are the inheritors not just of the last 200 years of astonishing progress since the industrial revolution, but that was built on a base of thousands and thousands of years of progress going before. And I was very glad to see. So I want to start getting into the cities that you're talking about, because you have cities going back 4,000 years as centers of innovation, and I think that's really important to say that the progress we've seen recently is not an aberration. It's what's been going on. We just happen to be the benefits of the accumulation of that over so many years. But let's first of all talk about why cities. Why, if you're looking at progress, why talk about cities? Because it's 40 cities that changed the world. So why are we talking about urban centers as opposed to the salty earth people like me out in the heartland?
So I didn't originally set out to write a book about cities, but when I sat down and made a list of the different aspects of the modern world that we all take for granted, everything from writing and a stable supply of food to modern sanitation, I found that many of those achievements and innovations could be traced to a particular place, and those places were all either cities or, in the era before there was really anything that we could count as a city, they tended to be the largest population centers that did exist at the time. And so the book ended up being focused on cities. And that begs the question of why that is. Why did so many of our great achievements come from places where many people gathered or lived together? And the answer to that is very simple. Just people. People generate ideas. People are the ones who engage in exchange and cooperation and competition and innovation. And wherever you have more people together interacting with one another, you get more of that. The more people you have, the more possibility for specialization, the more efficiencies in your economy that arise from that. So I don't think it's that surprising that while there, of course, have been some achievements from rural areas as well, you can find in the introduction to the book the example of the Wright brothers who came from a rural area and who first flew in an empty field. The majority of innovations throughout history have come from urban settings or the closest equivalent that existed at the time. And this is a history book that, like most history books, moves chronologically. It covers a very grand sweep of history from the agricultural revolution and the beginnings of permanent settlement all the way to the digital revolution. And it features each city or place in the book during a particular period of time. And in the early chapters, in the very distant history of humanity, those stretches of time tend to be longer, not because those places were so innovative that they just had very lengthy golden ages, but because progress occurred so painfully slowly in the past. And then once you get to the Industrial Revolution, things really speed up, and you see many more cities in that modern era in the book than in the distant past. And they also have shorter periods of time that would count as their peak of creativity when they really created innovations for the world, because not because we are less innovative today, but because progress happens so much faster now.
I also suspect it would also be not just because progress happens faster, but that once progress happens in one place, it quickly spreads out. So, industrialization happens in, I think Manchester is the one you use for that, right? Industrialization happens starts to happen in Manchester, but, in the late 18th, early 19th century, there's so much communication that's going to start immediately going to other cities. It's in England, it's going to start immediately going to Europe, it's going to start immediately going to America. Whereas perhaps in the past, the reason why you had a longer golden age is that it was hard. You could create the conditions for some sort of progress in one city, but that wouldn't spread as easily to other cultures. The information wouldn't be as easy to spread. The technology wouldn't be as easy to spread. So you'd have a longer period in which one area is supreme because nobody else is catching up.
Exactly. The same mechanism that allows cities typically to make more scientific advancement than the countryside, having more people together, more minds, that is just augmented even more once you get to the era of globalization, when people are communicating globally. And today, now that we have technology that allows people to communicate instantly while being thousands of miles apart, it's possible that we'll reach a point where more people will choose to live in rural areas while working remotely, and maybe the long-term trend we've seen up to this point in history of more and more people moving to cities could eventually reverse. You don't necessarily need cities themselves for progress. What matters is people. But I'm not in the business of predicting the future, and regardless of what happens to urban centers now in this age of technology, I think it's worth appreciating the incredible role that they've played in the past in creating the modern world. But of course, it's not all cities. All cities by definition are populous, but not all cities become major centers of innovation. So that gets to some other points the book makes about what other
so
conditions.
You were talking about what are the lessons we can learn. So
Yes.
that's what you're going to get to is what are the conditions that you see that make us, well, I'll get to some other points, but what are the conditions you see that make a city more innovative, or what are the sort of commonalities you see that cause these cities to become bursts of progress?
The cities featured in this book are incredibly diverse. They're all in different geographic areas, different eras of history, and yet there are some, as you say, commonalities. There are some lessons that I think that we can take away from looking at cities, at history's greatest centers of progress. It's not just having a lot of people together that necessarily creates innovation. those people need to be able to create innovation. They need to have the right conditions. One of those conditions seems to be peace. If you look at the cities in history that have really moved humanity forward, they have tended to do that during eras of relative peace. Now, this goes against an idea you sometimes hear that actually it's war that drives forward technology and progress. Many people believe that. An example they often give is the computer, and they say, well, if you look at the world wars, that's really when a lot of this computing technology was created because of interstate competition in war. And Matt Ridley points out in the foreword he very kindly provided for this book that while we can't rerun the experiment of history and see what would have been the case without world wars, if you look at the people who are working on early computing technology, they were divided in different countries that, due to the military conflict, were not able to communicate with one another. And even people who were in the same country, there were quite a few people working on early computing technology in the United States, due to the secrecy inherent in war, they weren't really able to communicate with each other. So it's possible that with less conflict in the world, we might have developed computing technology faster. And then who knows where we would be today, right? With all of the exciting developments in AI, it feels like we are in an age of incredible innovation in this area, but we could possibly be even further along if more people had been able to cooperate on the technological innovation throughout history. So while there are definitely exceptions, and it's true that the competition inherent in war does drive forward, obviously, weaponry technology, we have to remember that during peacetime, people are also in competition, but they are competing to try to provide goods and services that create value for people and are profitable.
This seems like a good example of the Bastiat broken window fallacy, that the economy is stimulated when you have to fix a broken window. He says, well, what would you have done with that money if you hadn't had to fix the broken window? And if the window hadn't been broken, you could have spent it on something else. Again, if we hadn't been spending technology on V2 rockets, or if Werner von Braun wasn't working on V2 rockets, he might have been working on rockets to get us to the moon earlier.
Precisely. There, obviously some technologies that originate from war and from weaponry can then turn out to have other uses. But in peacetime, when people are competing to bring goods and services to the market that raise living standards, that's usually how you get the kind of progress that we can all agree makes life better. And so that's why, with some exceptions, again, throughout history, it tends to be cities in times of relative peace that create these innovations that make up the modern world. There are some exceptions. Again, Mainz is an example in the book of a city that was torn apart by instability and riots and the civil war. And it is a case of a city where all of this violence and discord actually ended up becoming a catalyst for positive change, because so many of the printmaking apprentices of Johannes Gutenberg fled the city and created this diaspora who then carried printmaking knowledge to other places and spread that technology rapidly. And we all know that the printing press changed the world. So that can happen, but the lesson that I think we should take from that is that even with all of the wrong conditions for progress, sometimes human ingenuity still finds a way and something good can come of it. But when you have the right conditions for progress, then positive change just is incredibly more likely.
Now, I know that the last thing you talked about, though, is freedom as a condition of progress.
Last but definitely not least. So when you look at the cities, again, throughout world history that don't have very much in common besides creating incredible innovations, one thing that does jump out as a commonality is that these cities tend to be unusually open for their eras or their time periods. Now, obviously, when you're looking at the distant past, places in that time period would not be free by modern standards. Throughout most of history, societies tolerated slavery. Women did not have political liberty. Men didn't even have political liberty throughout most of history. So these are not places that we would consider free by modern standards, but relative to their era, it was the cities that allowed people the most leeway, that were the most open to people discussing new ideas, that were the most open to different sorts of people coming in and engaging in exchange. These were the places where change was possible, and you can't get positive change without the possibility of change itself. And
I don't know if you came across in your research the old saying, Stadtluft macht frei. City air makes you free.
Yes, that's cited in the introduction. And of course,
great.
that came from this medieval law granting serfs independence after spending a year and a day in a city. But like you, I agree that there's actually a wider application to that phrase, because cities often did provide more freedom than rural areas, which
Well,
we
I also think,
know
though,
can...
the original meaning of it was very significant too, because it meant that, the cities became magnets for people who were looking to say, I don't have to be a serf. I don't have to be limited by, where I was born and what I was born into. I can, and that's a part of this unleashing of creativity in these sort of German city states in the north. That, again, being a place that's open, where people's opportunities are open, where they're offered more freedom, that becomes an engine of progress.
Absolutely. And we see this throughout the grand sweep of history. Young people and people looking for opportunities, moving into urban areas to try out new jobs, to try to earn money, and to be able to meet more people. When you have more people gathered together, again, you have more choices on who to work with, do business with, more choices on who to befriend, more choices regarding who to spend your time with, engaged in this discussion and collaboration and competition. And that's really where we see progress emerge. And that can come from places that you would not expect. Many of the centers of progress featured in the book arose from relative obscurity and were very small and poor places initially, but they grew rapidly and took the world by storm because they were able to foster these environments of relative freedom and openness. And a great example would be Amsterdam. It started as this tiny fishing village. No one had heard of it. It's not the place anyone would have predicted would become a grand center of progress. And yet that famous hockey stick chart I know you're familiar with, showing how after centuries and centuries of the entire world being relatively equal in poverty, suddenly some countries began to take off and become wealthier. Suddenly lifespans became to exponentially grow. That change, many people say that it actually began in the Netherlands and specifically in Amsterdam. So how did this tiny fishing village become the city to first create a stock exchange, to first create a proto corporation or conglomerate? How did all of these innovations take place there? And the answer does seem to have been just an incredible atmosphere of openness. First of all, they were open to different sorts of people at a time when Europe's wars of religion meant that there was an incredible atmosphere of intolerance for different religious groups. For example, Amsterdam earned the nickname haven in Yiddish because it allowed people of the Jewish faith in, it allowed people of different Protestant faiths who often did not get along in that time period to all enter the city. It even tolerated some form of Catholicism at a time when Catholics and Protestants were often very violent toward one another. And by allowing people of all of these different backgrounds into one place and welcoming immigrants of different backgrounds and letting them come do business in their city, they were definitely able to benefit from all of this creativity of people with different viewpoints. And they allowed even very controversial viewpoints to be expressed in a time period when there was a lot of censorship. Freedom of speech was not really a widely held concept. They allowed thinkers as different as Thomas Hobbes and John Locke to publish their works. The Amsterdam printing presses would publish what no one else in Europe would touch. So I know that you're familiar with this, but just in case anyone watching isn't, Hobbes obviously was a believer in absolute monarchy. John Locke, the father of liberalism, in that sense you were talking about at the beginning of this interview, they couldn't be more different. And yet both of their viewpoints were tolerated in one place. And by having so much openness to discussion, so much freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of different viewpoints, Amsterdam fostered an environment where people could try new things, and that led to these incredible innovations.
Well, Amsterdam could really be called the birthplace of freedom of speech, because it was there in the 1680s, excuse me, that I believe John Locke wrote the Letter Concerning Toleration, which is like the, I think, most important document in terms of setting out the theory behind freedom of speech as we know it today. And he wrote that while hiding out in Amsterdam because of his political views, and being able to publish whatever he wanted in the press there. So again, that serving as a haven and a free space for people to think and to live and to talk and to publish new ideas, that became again a radical technology that would then come back across with Locke back to Britain and have an impact in sort of helping to supercharge the birth of the Enlightenment there. So yeah, this is it's interesting how, especially as we get later here in history, that you have these interlocking things, that the progress that happens in Amsterdam, it's so close to Britain that it becomes influential to Britain, it becomes influential to Germany, etc. And I have a whole sort of scrappy merchant republic theory of history, where I think if you go back and you look at, where a lot of progress occurs, where it gets moved forward, it's a scrappy little merchant republic.
Absolutely. Another great example of that in the book would probably be Dubrovnik, which is one of my favorite chapters because it's a city I didn't know very much about before doing research on it for this book. And I think many people are unfamiliar with its history. It was at one point a city-state
First of all, tell people where it is, because,
Dubrovnik, yes. It's in Croatia today. Today, it's a tourism-oriented city. It's coastal. It's a very lovely place to visit, I'm sure. But it has a very long history. It was at one point a republic city-state called the Republic of Ragusa. And they, throughout their history, were unusually devoted to freedom for their time. Their motto was libertas, just the Latin word for liberty. Their motto was a Latin phrase that translates to "liberty is not sold for all the gold in the world." And this city-state was, if you count it as a country, among the first countries to ban the trade of slaves. So they were very open to freedom in a way that most medieval places were not, and that included economic freedom as well. This was a sort of medieval Hong Kong, a free trading, seafaring supernova port city that facilitated trade with neighboring lands. And again, they were very open regarding this. They were at a sort of crossroads in Europe where they were situated, and they would do trade with people of different religions and all over the area. But when the Black Death pandemic struck Europe and absolutely devastated the continent, often killing half or even more than half of the population in every city that it reached, Dubrovnik was also the first city to implement a coherent public health response to that pandemic, which was really more devastating than we can imagine. We've all just lived through the COVID pandemic, but the death rate from that was nothing compared to the Black Death. This was an incredibly...
like a third of the population dying kind of thing, yeah.
Yes, a third, and often more in urban areas where people live close together. It could be half, it could be 60%, depending on where you're looking. And it wasn't just one outbreak killing off a third or half of your population, then you were done. There were repeated outbreaks. So it was a very difficult time economically as well in Europe, and Venice, comparable trade-reliant city-state had to actually completely shut down at one point because of repeated outbreaks of the plague and close their ports. But by implementing limited waiting periods and the first quarantine waiting periods, Dubrovnik was actually able to keep its ports open and continue to trade throughout the Black Death pandemic period. And they even achieved significant mercantile expansion and economic growth in that period, which is incredibly impressive. And so that's just another example of innovation emerging thanks to a city cultivating an atmosphere of freedom. And economic freedom in particular, I don't think many people appreciate just how important it has been throughout history. Obviously, all forms of freedom, whether that's freedom of speech that we just talked about, an openness to different sorts of people, those are all important. But economic freedom, it doesn't just create economic growth and technological innovations, although those are very important too. It's been important to many different kinds of innovation throughout history. I think many people don't realize that Isaac Newton's Principia, the culmination of the scientific revolution, was first funded by funds donated by the heir to a soap mogul, a thriving soap business. And writing, one of the most foundational aspects of civilization, was first created not for poetry, not for writing down the genealogies of kings, but actually by accountants for the purpose of record keeping. And
I have a book on my shelf called Capitalism and Arithmetic, which talks about this idea that advances in mathematics were pushed forward by the needs of accountants to keep all these accounts straight. And you're absolutely right about writing that. I think it's the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York has an excellent display of these sort of early clay tablets and things like that. And what you'll discover about most of them is that it's really talking about, well, here's a contract about land, or here's a contract about trade, or here's a bill of lading basically for a shipment. And that's what a lot of this was used for.
Absolutely. Many of the earliest surviving writings we have in cuneiform on clay tablets are shopping receipts, are inventory lists. So these are the things that first compelled humanity to develop writing, from which we get so much.
There's a guy who has achieved immortality and is still mentioned 5,000 years later because he sold somebody a bad batch of bronze. This is one of the early tablets. It's a letter complaining about the poor quality of this guy's bronze, and we're still speaking his name 5,000 years later because because he sold poor quality goods.
Being able to share that kind of information also helps the market to function more efficiently. But again, it's not just economic development. Also, the great artworks that have been created throughout history, the ones that are still talked about today, whether that was the art of Renaissance Florence or the classical music that came out of Vienna, or the invention of the novel in medieval Kyoto. These artistic achievements that are so beloved even today came about frequently because an atmosphere was created where different artists were drawn into one place to compete and collaborate, because art was made incredibly lucrative. When there was an economic incentive to create great artwork, well, that has produced many of the most world-changing works of art that humanity now cherishes. So there's this idea.
I know you have a chapter on Florence, and there was really important is that, again, a scrappy little merchant republic. It was the Medicis, who were wool merchants, made their fortune as wool merchants before becoming leaders of the city. That you not only had a lot of money to then put into art and music and the first some of the first operas were done there. You not only had a lot of money to go into it, but it was money from diverse sources. It wasn't just money from the church. It wasn't just money from the kings. It was money from the merchants and from the middle class. And you had a greater diversity of sources of money, which created a greater diversity of art.
Absolutely. And so those innovations of Florence in finance, they had so many great innovations in banking. and their atmosphere of trade and economic freedom allowed many different families to rise up and become wealthy, and then they engaged in a competition to patronize the best artists, and that artistic patronage really helped to create, well, again, some of the most beloved artwork throughout history. And so there's this idea I think many people have of the starving artist, and the idea that a true artist only creates art for its own sake. They don't need any sort of financial reward. But what we actually see in history is that many of the artworks that we still marvel at today and study, and that many of the greatest innovations in artistic techniques actually came about when it was very financially lucrative to do so, and when there was competition among the elites in that society to patronize the best artists. So I don't think many people realize just how many different forms of progress can come from economic freedom and the prosperity that produces.
Now, one last aspect of this I want to talk about is that, we talk a lot about Western civilization and the Western cities, but I was also struck by the fact that you have a huge variety of cities across the globe, that this was not just, it's not just a recent phenomenon since the Industrial Revolution, but it's also not just a European or Western phenomenon. And one of those that struck me was, I think it's Mohenjo-Daro.
Yes, yes. Mohenjo-Daro is a city in what is today Pakistan that the ancient and not very well understood Indus Valley civilization created. And they had innovations in plumbing that were more advanced even than the famously advanced for the time period plumbing system of the later Roman civilization. And that is a very sad chapter in some ways, because it's a reminder that progress can be lost. It is not necessarily linear. The people of this ancient city in what is today Pakistan had better plumbing than many people who came after them. And that is a recurring theme throughout the book, just how fragile the conditions for progress are and how easily they can be lost. Another great example of a non-Western city in the book that has a similar lesson would be Hong Kong, obviously a bit more recent. So in the 1960s and 70s, Hong Kong transformed from one of the poorest cities on the planet, with poverty comparable to some places in sub-Saharan Africa today, or even worse, to one of the wealthiest and most dazzling cosmopolitan cities. And this whirlwind transformation in the 60s and 70s came about largely through the adoption of policies of non-interventionism, essentially just stepping back and really freeing the people of Hong Kong to better their own situation through market exchange, through innovation. And of course, we have seen how the crackdown since then on Hong Kong has led to the loss of many of those conditions that allowed for Hong Kong's rise in the first place. Civil liberties, economic freedom, fiscal property, all of these things are now being lost thanks to the Chinese Communist Party. And so it's a very sad lesson, but it's also a reminder that these common conditions for progress, people, peace, and freedom, they are universal, and they can help people in any place around the world to better their conditions. Many people have asked that question of why Europe? Why was it Europe where we first saw this great liftoff and escape from poverty begin? And some people think it was unique cultural factors. There are all sorts of different theories, but it does seem that there are conditions that are universal, that people anywhere in the world can adopt, that can help them to achieve prosperity and even to turn their city into the next great center of progress that could create an innovation that will change lives for hundreds of years.
And let's talk about, I guess, close with this idea that yes, there, excuse me, these golden ages do tend to not last because the conditions. Now, sometimes it's economic. I think Mohenjo-Daro, wasn't it, that the Indus River changed course and suddenly they were not at the opportune place, and that you see that a lot throughout history. The river silts up and then that old city is abandoned and all the energy goes to a new city somewhere farther downstream. But But there are also cases where you can lose the progress because you sabotage those conditions, or you're not able to maintain those conditions. And I think that is in a way as a lesson to us now about why we have to defend liberalism and why we have to sort of understand this history, understand why those conditions are so important, so that we don't was it America's? I take comfort in the fact, by the way, that a lot of these places, you look at the Roman Empire, their golden ages can last for up to 500 years. And, America's only 240 years old, 248 years old now. We got a ways to go before we become as decadent as the Romans. But, or maybe we're on an accelerated path. You can argue one way or the other. But there is that always that cautionary tale hanging out there that those conditions you have to work to maintain those conditions for progress.
Absolutely. Another example of that in the book would be Baghdad, which today no one thinks of as a center of progress. It's one of the most dangerous cities in the world. Not a great place to be, but there was an era during the Islamic Golden Age, so-called, when Baghdad was one of the wealthiest and most innovative cities in the world. They had what was called the House of Wisdom, which was a center of scholarship, a sort of proto-university, and where thinkers from many different cultures and backgrounds and lands came together and made world-changing innovations in mathematics, in astronomy, so many leaps forward in human understanding in different eras. And then all of that unraveled very quickly because of the loss of those conditions that are necessary: freedom and peace. So first, let's look at freedom. There was a political change, and a faction took over in the city, which did not appreciate this openness that the city had had up to that point. They had a much more closed view. They believed you could only get knowledge from a single source, the Quran, and they limited what people were able to say. They were much less open to scholars of different religious backgrounds, whereas up until that point, Christians and others were able to work together in this city. And the Muslim scholars were also much more limited in what they could say compared to before. And this incredible attitude of openness that the city had had prior to that was extinguished very quickly. My colleague Mustafa Akrol has written about this extensively, and I encourage people to check out his work to understand exactly what happened there. But prior to that, Al-Kindi, one of the great thinkers of this city, has a great quote that you can find in the book, where he says that knowledge can come from anywhere, and we ought not to be afraid of seeking knowledge, regardless of who speaks it, from any land, from any background. And so this sort of attitude in the medieval time period was remarkably tolerant, and yet all of that was extinguished almost overnight by this change in who was ruling over the city. And then the ultimate undoing of Baghdad came in the form of the loss of peace through war with the Mongol invasion. And it said that the river there ran black with ink because so many written works were destroyed during the conflict. So I do think that it is a reminder that policy matters, that as much as we don't like politics, it's also important to pay attention to them, because change can happen very quickly. The conditions for progress can be lost, and by safeguarding liberty and peace and the conditions for progress, we need to do that through conscious effort, because these conditions really are so fragile.
Well, this has been a fascinating little brief overview, and I don't want to have you try to draw out too much more, because I want people to go read the book. But I think that's a great idea of how looking at all these detailed histories of different areas around the world can draw important lessons. So thanks so much for talking about this today.
Thank you, Rob.
I'm Rob Tracinski. My guest today has been Chelsea Follett, managing editor of humanprogress.org, a site I recommend, and author of Centers of Progress, 40 Cities That Changed the World. If you enjoyed this conversation, please hit like or subscribe on your favorite podcasting platform. And you can also find more ideas about the nature of a free society at symposium.substack.com. Thank you for joining the conversation.